Welcome everybody again. So today's talk is going to be about how conditioning shapes us and how we let go. And in some ways, it's a little bit of a continuation of the previous talk that I gave, where we said, let's go explore the three marks of existence: anicca, dukkha, and anatta. And these are foundational teachings within Buddhism. And we spent some time in the previous talk, I believe it was sometime in early August, and we recorded that too. And we talked about conditioning and about sankharas and how they're impermanent. And we talked about conditioning which comes up from large cultural forces, from marketing, things around us, which shape our conditioning. We'll talk about that and we'll expand upon that a little bit, but today we'll spend a little bit more time talking about moment-by-moment conditioning, moment-by-moment awareness that arises, and see how that creates conditioning too. So let's go get some historical context again. So I spoke about the three marks of existence, the three lakshana: anicca, dukkha, and anatta. Right? So the Buddha called this the three marks of existence. But it wasn't existence of, the bell or existence of this piece of paper. He talked about your existence. So this was all about your existence. He did not go into physics. He did not go into metaphysics. He talked about your existence. And he qualified that three statements a little bit more. He said, "Sabbe sankhara anicca." And he said, all conditioned things are impermanent. Sankhara, sankhara. And we talked about this as samskara in Sanskrit, which is the conditioned mind, a behavior pattern. And so he talked about that. And what was interesting about the Buddha was that he used words very intentionally. Now, he said, "Sabbe sankhara anicca." Right? So all conditioned things are impermanent. He could have as easily said, "Sabbe anicca." But he did not. Right? Sabbe anicca would have meant everything is impermanent. And the reason he did not say that is not because it's not true. I think many of us have a sense that that is true. But he didn't say that because he was not talking about physics. He was not talking about metaphysics. He was not talking about, the Big Bang and changes. He was not talking about physics. He was not talking about the nature of reality. He was talking about how we can understand our own existence, and by understanding that, how do we get to freedom? Now, if he had said, "Sabbe anicca," he probably would have been right. Now, we have started going into that by understanding other forms of knowledge, right? So we've got physics, we've got metaphysics that go into that a little bit more. Now, we also know when we're seeing things that sabbe anicca is also true. And this is a picture that comes to mind. I don't know if you can share this on Zoom too, JJ. But the picture you're seeing there, the left and the right, are the exact same place. the exact same angle, actually slightly different angle, but they're separated by about, I want to say, 4 years. On the left is a fire lookout cabin in the Bull of the Woods wilderness. Bull of the Woods wilderness is a beautiful pocket of wilderness a little south and east of here. You go along the Clackamas River, and then you start heading a little bit along the Kullawash River. Then you have to go on a dirt road for a little bit longer. It takes about 2 hours to get there. But this beautiful wilderness. And we actually used to do mindful wilderness hikes a few years ago. And I led a group there, and we hiked up to that fire lookout on the left. We started about, I think, 4,500 feet. We got to about 6,000 feet of elevation, not too high. And then we got there, and we sat, and we meditated for about 10 minutes. And then we did a little bit more loop around that and came back. About a year after the last hike, there was a riverside fire. And then there was the Beachy Creek fire. Both of them met. It exploded. And what you're seeing on the right is what was left. I went there 2 weeks ago. So we know that Sabbe Anicca is also true. But that takes us more into thinking mind, into physics. And those of you who are thinking might start thinking, well, what's the physics law about Sabbe Anicca? And what's the English word of that? It's probably going to be the second law of thermodynamics, right? Entropy, disorder in a system increases, or rather does not decrease. So that may be, if the Buddha was talking about the second law of thermodynamics, he might have said, Sabbe Anicca. But he did not say that. He said, Sabbe Sankhara Anicca. Sabbe Sankhara Anicca. So what is this Sankhara? What is this Sankhara? And how does it arise? Sankhara is conditioned mind, behavior patterns. Right? And this is where one of the Buddha's teachings about something called pratitya samutpada comes in. It's a mouthful. Pratitya means dependent. Samutpada means arising. Dependent arising. This is one of the teachings of the Buddha. Now, I'll have to refer to my notes a little bit over here. And what he said to explain this was, when this exists, that comes to be. With the arising of this, that arises. So let me say that again. When this exists, that comes to be. This exists, that comes to be. So he says there is a requisite, a precondition. When that exists, the next thing arises. And when that next thing arises, the next thing arises. Right? So that is why he calls this pratitya samutpada. And then he goes on to say, when this does not exist, that does not come to be. Cessation of this, with the cessation of this, that ceases. Right? So it's still a little wordy, it's in your head, but there's this kind of sense that you have a prerequisite, and because of that, something happens. When this happens, something else happens, and then something else happens. So that was the basic construct of pratitya samutpada. But Let's talk a little bit more about, actually, let's go to the next picture if you don't mind, JJ. Let's go to the next picture. Okay. There we go. Yeah, that. Yeah, there we go. So some of you might have seen a picture that looks like this. And I think we might actually have a tapestry that looks like this somewhere in here too. It's a Tibetan wheel of life. Right? And one of the interesting things about this picture over here is it's got Buddhist psychology, it's got Tibetan cosmology, it's got some mythology all built in over here. And it's going to be hard to say, so I'm not going to have you folks look at this too deeply in here. But the outer ring has 12 steps in that. And we'll actually go through that in a little bit more detail. It's called the 12 steps of dependent origination. But it's a very beautiful mythology in here. And then in the middle, you have these things called the 6 realms. And then you have, the hungry ghost and folks like things like that. And a lot of times in the Tibetan cosmology, this has been meant to talk about birth and rebirth. And so that's the belief system that the Tibetans have about cosmology. Now, whether that's scientifically proven or not, it's a different topic. We'll think about this more as mythology, cosmology from a different tradition, the culture. But this picture, if we were to simplify that, and this is something that I try to do to try and understand this, I said, how could I simplify this? How could I make this a little simpler for me to try and understand? And so this is where we went to the next picture. And there's 12 steps in here, and you may be able to see it, you may not be able to see it, but we'll try to break this down a little bit more. And what I've also done is I've reordered some of this to make sure that it follows our personal understanding a little bit more, to help us understand that. Even though the Buddha talked about pratitya samutpada in one of his first teachings, now the Dharma Chakra Pravartana Sutta, the turning of the wheel of the Dharma, that was his first talk, his first sutta. He talked about the dependent origination there. But he didn't have 12 steps in that. Right? As Buddhism grew, there was this combination of Hindu mythology, Buddhist mythology, Tibetan mythology that all came together and created these 12 steps in here. So sometimes this can get a little heady and a little difficult to understand. So I try to reorder that a little bit in a way that makes sense to me. So you start with the body. Everything starts with the body. And that's one of the reasons why when we were meditating today, we talked about the body. We start with the body. We all have a body. It doesn't matter how many wheels, circles we have a body. We can start with that. It's called nama rupa, naming the form of the physical body. So we start with the body. If we have the body, if this, then that, the Buddha said. If the body, then we have the 6 senses. We're able to see, we're able to hear, smell, and we're able to have the body sensations in here too. So, hearing, seeing, smelling, tasting. A little piece of trivia in here. It turns out we have other senses too other than these 6, right? It's this concept of being aware of where you are in space. Proprioception is another sense. It also turns out we don't have a real way of sensing wetness. We can't really sense wet, it turns out. Interesting piece of trivia. We can sense whether something is cold, and slippery. And you combine those two and you assume it's wet. So sometimes when things are not wet, you can actually feel that they're wet if they're slippery and cold. So senses, we have senses. We have the body, we have the senses. That seems fairly obvious. But then the next thing that happens is a sense object coming in touch with a sense organ. The sound getting in contact with your ear. Something that is aromatic getting in touch with your smell organ. There's contact. Right? You're seeing something, it comes in contact with you. So body, sense objects, sense organs, and contact. These are things that are happening constantly. And when we slow down in our meditation, we're able to get in touch with the sensations of the body, the sensations of breathing. And we are paying attention to those sensory objects. And the Buddha says, right after we get contact between the sound and the sense organ, or the sense object and the sense organ, there is Vedana. There is liking, disliking, or indeterminate. So as we were meditating, we first try to get in touch with the body sensation. What are we feeling in the body? And the body is alive. And is that sensation pleasant, unpleasant, or indeterminate? Are we liking it, disliking it, or is it neutral? So we were practicing this whole process as we were going through. And then the Buddha says again, once you have liking, disliking, or this neutral, indeterminate feeling, the next step after that is craving. Craving. The Pali word for that is tanha, or thirst. Right? It's as if you're thirsty for something. Liking something because there was a sensation that came in is causing craving. Disliking, causing aversion, that's also a form of craving. And from then, you go on to clinging, then you go on to something called becoming, then you go on to something called birth, death, ignorance, sankhara, conditioning, and consciousness. But before we go into all those different phases, is there a sense of what's happening in here where perhaps once you hear something, it could be the sound of a motorcycle outside. Now, if you're the kind of person who likes motorcycles, you might be like, oh, that's a nice sound. I wish I was out riding right now. And you've gone into this story. You're out on Highway 224, going along the Clackamas, you're riding, right? That story got born. It went through all its trials and tribulations, and it just continued there. If you're the kind of person who doesn't like the sound of motorcycles, I'm like, oh, why are they doing this today? I hate motorcycles. And you've got your own stories about, oh, poor me, why do I have to listen to these motorcycles? So on a moment-by-moment basis, you're having craving, clinging, stories arising, passing away, creating conditioning. Conditioning is happening on a moment-by-moment basis, depending on every single sensation we're facing. And one of the really interesting words that the Buddha uses is becoming. We're just not thinking about riding that motorcycle. We become the motorcycle rider. Or we become the person who doesn't like motorcycles. So, on a moment-by-moment basis, we have the opportunity to peel back our conditioning. These sankharas, there are old sankharas, and that's happened because of sometimes intergenerational trauma. It's happening because of conditioning that happened to us in our childhood, in our family of origin. There are sankharas called modernism, postmodernism. That's the conditioning that we all have. These are old sankharas. But sankharas are happening on a moment-by-moment basis every single time we have a sensation. And here's the most interesting thing about what the Buddha said. He said, when this does not exist, that does not come to be. With the cessation of this, that ceases. So where might you be able to manage this chain of causation here? Now, of course, you might say, I want to sit in a calm environment, quiet. There's not going to be too many sounds. So you can reduce the number of sensations that are happening. So that's one possibility. And when we go into retreat, we do some of that. But a lot of times we cannot be in retreat. We're living in the daily world. Sensations are coming in every day. They're coming in emails, texts, tweets, whatever have you. They're all coming in. What we can do is be aware of, are we liking that, disliking that, or are we neutral? Based upon that, that becomes craving and clinging. But if you can break this chain of causality and say, an email came in. What if my first response was not I like it, dislike it, or indifferent? If I were to say, I will neither like it nor dislike it. I will just be aware of it as an email that came in. I will be aware of the sound as a sound. I will be aware of the sight as a sight, the smell as a smell. All of a sudden, we are changing our own narrative of what happens after that. It's very similar to the story of the two arrows that the Buddha talked about. The first arrow, which is the sensation coming in, we may or may not have the ability to avoid that. Sometimes you can, sometimes you cannot. We'll live in society, we'll live in a city, we'll live in community. So these sensations start coming in. But the second arrow of how we respond to that is where we have a sense of autonomy, of control. If we can say, I will neither like or dislike, you're now removing the rest of those causality chains in here. And this was something that the Buddha came up with 2,600 years ago, just by observing his own thoughts, his reactions, his responses. So perhaps this is something that we can take into our own daily lives, in our practice. Every time we have sensations coming in, be aware of the contact with our mind object or sense objects. And then, if possible, could we not like or dislike? This is very difficult to do, especially with some of the big conditioning. With the big conditioning, it's really hard to do. So, a suggestion and invitation is to turn towards that sensation in as much as it is possible in this present moment. We have a lifetime of conditioning. Looking directly at that lifetime of conditioning all at once can be overwhelming. It's like looking at the sun. You can't look at the sun directly all at once. You can look at it sideways. You can look at it a little glancingly. But if it's possible to start looking back, then you start trying to undergo the deconditioning of your sankharas. And this is what the Buddha meant by saying, Sabbe sankhara anicca. He said, your conditioning is impermanent. And you can see that and you can operationalize that using these 12 steps of dependent origination. So he gave us a pathway to actually decondition ourselves and see things as they really are. And that's what we practiced this morning. Vipassana, seeing things as they really are. Seeing things as they really are. So let's see if we can break this down a little bit more, right? These are a lot of words, concepts. And I try to do this a little bit when I was out skiing. And I played with fear and terror, right? Fear, biological response. Terror is conditioning. And so I'm more of a beginner skier, but, well, I guess an intermediate skier. And I like to go skiing where there's no groomed trails. And to do that, you have to get these all-terrain skis, and you put skins on them, and then you climb up. And then after you go up, you take the skins off, you lock your skis down, and you ski down. So last winter, I did that. Got my skis, all-terrain skis, I put on the skins, and I was climbing up. It was a beautiful, clear day, blue skies, and it was a perfect time to go skiing. So as I was climbing, it got a little steeper, it got a little steeper, and it got pretty steep at a certain point. And it got so steep that the skins on my skis could not support me going up, and I started slipping down. And this is not a safe place to be. Now you're starting to slip backwards. I actually fell about 20 to 30 feet, slipping downwards. And at that time, my fear was very present, right? And this was a good thing, because it filled me full of adrenaline. I was clawing to make sure that I wouldn't fall and pick up more speed, because more speed you pick up, you're going to go down and there'll be some bad damage. But because I was able to claw myself and kick myself in, I just slipped about 20 feet or so, and I was able to come to a stop. So that fear was a good thing. However, because of that fear, I was now in this position where terror was coming up. Oh no, what have I done? I'm literally in over my skis, and I need to do something about this. Well, I very gingerly, carefully kind of sidestepped some of the more steeper spaces, and I got to the top of where I wanted to get to, where I could then try to ski downhill. But the terror has built up quite a bit at this point in time. This conditioning, right? So there was this impact of the sensation, there was the disliking, there was the craving, clinging, all the stories got created, and I was in all this conditioning of terror. Now, it turned out this was actually a very icy day, even though it was clear outside. It was a beautiful blue sky, but it was windy and cold. And the snow was really icy. And I'm not a great skier. So I had to ski down ungroomed snow, and I had terror. If I were to look at the top and say, here's all the way down that I need to get to, that was too much for me. I could not look towards that terror. So the first thing that I tried to do is to say, well, let me not worry about getting all the way down there. Can I make it down one stretch before I have to make a turn? At that point, I was able to turn towards that and say, I can make one turn. I don't know about the second turn, I have no idea. But the first turn I can do. So I was able to look towards that and say, here's a manageable amount of pain that I can look at. And then recognize that this was unpleasant. This was very unpleasant. But that ability to look at that unpleasantness was something that was tempered by controlling the story that had already arisen. Now I went through one turn, and things weren't too bad. And then I made a second turn. Second turn was also okay. But the minute I looked down and said I have to go all the way down and make probably, 30 turns, I'm just frozen with fear, with terror. So how might that be a way for you to think about managing what you look at and start peeling back that experience and getting to understanding and seeing the liking and the disliking, and then seeing where there's contact and sensation. Sometimes the stories are so overwhelming that it's hard for us to go back to what was it that caused this. Also, during our practice this morning, we did our attention practice, but then we went into metta and karuna. And we did this in community. Right? So we said, let's wish ourselves loving kindness. May I be safe. May I be healthy, happy, and live with ease. May we be free from fear and suffering. We have to offer ourselves metta and karuna in order to be able to kind of see this, because sometimes this is so overwhelming. But we can do this on a moment-by-moment basis. And I think that's the beauty of how conditioning can be something that shapes us, but gives us an opportunity to also let go. So what is it that happens to you on a moment-by-moment basis? How might you be able to look at that? How might you be able to see that as liking and disliking? And can you go backwards and say, this is just the sound. This is just the sight. This is just the smell. This is just the thought. The thought is just a thought. Is that something that you can take off the cushion and practice that too? And I think that's the invitation for us from the Buddha. How might we look at conditioning, see that as impermanent on a moment-by-moment basis? So let me pause over here and see if there's something that comes up for people. What is the moment-by-moment awareness that is coming up for you all? Yeah. And we can get some sharing from people on Zoom, people in the room. Please use the microphone. But are there these examples of conditioning that come to you?